You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Now, we've heard the term lethality. We've heard kinetic effects. We've heard non-kinetic effects. We've heard lethal effects, non-lethal effects, destructive effects, non-destructive effects, non-kinetic, lethal effects, kinetic, non-lethal effects. But what do all these words mean? Now, there are a few other words I'd like to use to describe these words, but I'm the PG version of this show, so I won't use them because I might get carried away. G'day, listeners, and welcome back to The Dead Prussian. I'm your host, the humblest host there is, of a show named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. I'd like to thank all the iTunes reviews. I'd also like to thank all the listeners that have written in to inform me about any of the audio issues you've been having. It's been great getting that support. It's been a little bit rubbish knowing that there's so many audio issues out there with so many different versions of the software and the types of systems people are playing them through, but I think we've cracked the nut. So if you had a problem with episodes 80, 81, and 82, re-download them or stream them again and let me know if it's fixed it. I also want to thank all those people that gave me the 5 stars, and there is a bunch of people currently sitting in, I'm pretty sure they're in Kabul, that I wanted to give a shout out to. It is Timbo, a bloke who wrote to me and said, hey, we're the air advisors in the Afghan Ministry of Defence, and we want to say good day, and by the way, your audio levels are shit. And I was like, thanks, Timbo. So this is my shout out to the Aussies, Strongy and Swill, and the Brits, Ash, Rich, and Timbo. And there's also Amanda, the tame American, which I don't believe. But also another Aussie who has left the team, Napalm Dave. Thanks, Napalm, for listening to the show. I do not want to know how you got that name, but I guess, we're not going to go into that. But what we are going to go into is what's with all the words we use to euphemize and describe what militaries do. It's got nothing to do with our air advisors in Kabul. They were just the most blunt people to tell me about my audio levels. I've got someone else to talk about the different types of effects. Now, my guest today has quite an extensive bio. So extensive, I've already read it out a couple of times. So I'll give you the Cliff Notes. And if you don't know what Cliff Notes are, they're how I got through uni a couple of times. Now, my guest today is Matthew Ford, Dr. Matthew Ford, in fact, and he's a lecturer at the University of Sussex. He's also written a book. He's lectured and taught at University of Hull, at Birkbeck College, at King's College London, which is actually where he got his PhD from, and also the University of Birmingham. Before that, he was a strategic analyst with Policy and Capability Studies Department in the UK Ministry of Defence, and he's done a little bit of writing and a little bit of editing for some great journals out there, notably a founding editor of the British Journal for Military History. But he also happens to have one of our most ever popular episodes, or most popular episodes ever. I speak better in that episode. And that's his book, Weapon of Choice. That was a discussion he and I had about the development of small arms. Now, that's not T-Rex small arms. That's actually small arms rifles. If you're listening to this show, you probably understand what I mean by small arms. But just in case you're a paleontologist who's wandered onto the wrong show, not the type of small arms you're interested in. That episode was very, very popular. If you haven't heard it, go back and make it more popular. Just don't tell Matt, because he has been rubbing it in my face for a while. And with his appearance on the show this time, he is either equal first or definitely second in terms of most appeared on The Dead Prussian. He now beats Hugh Davies and August Cole, and he's up there now with Pauline Shanks-Corinne. So you can kind of tell who actually answers my emails. Notably, Matt's bio has one addition on the website. He is a visiting scholar at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. That's in the US, for those people who don't know where California is. And that was in May 2019, which is this year that we're recording it. Matt, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Hey, Mick, how you doing?
I'm doing amazing.
A glowing introduction, I might add. I did think that it made sense to not give the full biog again, because you just bore the shit out of people, to be honest.
Yeah, and look, I'm glad you thought it was a glowing bio, because I tell you what, with everything you've done, it was really hard to make it look good. But we put some glitter on it. Some people might know what we rolled. We rolled the proverbial in glitter, and we got a bio out of it. But hey, our listeners know you because you won't stop coming on the show.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, well, it's a bit like my biog is a bit like the word salad that is the article you decided to use for this episode on lethality.
Yeah, well, hey, that article is a word salad about word salads.
That's true. That's very true.
It's a Waldorf and a Caesar almost. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, Waldorf's the guy who stabbed Caesar. Now, before we get started on talking about your article, which focuses on the epistemology, which is a big word that I mispronounce quite regularly, which is featured on a Cambridge website. So I'll put it up there on the Cambridge Call website. It's actually free to download. So for some reason, the paywall mafia haven't got their hands on it. So it's out there for everyone. It's the epistemology of lethality, bullets, knowledge, trajectories, and kinetic effects. Now, before we start getting into it, we start attacking some of these words, and I really want to spend some time attacking the way some of these things occur. I want to find out why you started researching this. You've gone from small arms research into the epistemology of a bunch of really annoying words.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Well, the fact of the matter is that small arms got me into lethality, a lot of the stuff I've written in this article, I knew. If people go and take a look at the article, their eyes may roll into the back of their heads as they think about, that Sood's corner might be the phrase that comes to mind as they read through this article. But the fact of the matter is that I'd sort of taken all this theory stuff, all of these academic ideas, and dropped them out of my book, Weapon of Choice, and held them back because there was just so many things that needed to be covered that hadn't quite, I couldn't easily get into a book that I was trying to make as accessible as possible. Whereas, so this, it is aimed at a more academic audience. But, I used words like lethality, hence I used the word epistemology, and knowledge trajectories have got very specific academic overtones, right? Based in philosophy, in terms of the theory of knowledge, epistemology, theory of knowledge, and knowledge trajectories framed around the ideas that a sociology of knowledge would discuss. So there's sort of there's immediately an academic overtone to it. But I also knew that you guys are spending all your time talking about lethality and effect, and I figured that there's one way of hooking in academics who are interested in epistemology and sociology of knowledge, and people in uniform who go, "What the hell is this lethality thing?" And if I combine them into one, nicely sounding title for an article, I might even get people to read it. It was kind of clickbait, but for people who are interested in weird stuff. So that's what that. It was purposefully framed in this way. But certainly what I would hope to do as we chat today is sort of decompress the language a little bit, so that I help explain my thinking about these words, and hopefully you've got a lot to say. I know, because the pre-show warm-up there were lots of things that you were telling me. You've got lots to say about the notions of lethality and kinetic effect from a perspective of someone in uniform, right? So I think there's a good opportunity to try and sort of have a meeting of minds, as it were, to see whether we can make sense of some of these things, because in this article, I try to show you how the science of killing is a contested problem. It's a scientifically contested set of problems, and I try to put the science back into this, if you like.
Yeah, and I like how you said you gave the article an enticing title. Now, this is a difficult one for me because I noticed the article, so I can't really argue that it's not enticing. But just to confirm for our average Joe listeners out there, the epistemology of lethality, bullets, knowledge trajectories, and kinetic effects. Now, if that was a hamburger, you wouldn't sell it. So let's go into some of the verbiage, and looking at the first section in here for our listeners, so they can get a bit of an understanding what you're getting at here. Now, you talk about locating lethality, which in itself is a great phrase, because what is it? Where is it? You talk about knowledge regimes, assemblages, and the ontologies of war.
Yeah.
What's this all about?
What's this word salad? So locating lethality is really about trying to position this idea in a broader, both military framework of thinking, and also the perspective of someone who's interested in understanding the way lethality works academically in terms of a sociology of knowledge. What work does lethality do for organizations? And when I say work, I mean, why are people using this term? And so once you start understanding why people are using this term, you start to realize that lots of different people are using the term, not necessarily in exactly the same way. And I suppose the opportunity from an academic point of view is to sort of decompose how people are using this term differently to explain why it does work in the organization. Why do people like using the word? Now, I hope that makes sense. I mean, in this respect, it's sort of, when I sort of say the sociology of knowledge, what I mean is that all words have these, that they emerge from somewhere. They come into practice and use. And I suppose this article is about trying to show how they come into practice, how they come into use, and why they're used in the way that they are used. I can't remember, what was the other questions you had? Ontology. So ontology is really, what's the nature of war? Right? So what does this tell us about the nature of war and nature of fighting? Is there something, is there something going on here that automatically, I quote the likes of Brighton and Bakawi, Shane Brighton and Tarek Bakawi, and they wrote a very important article. And they cite war in terms of, they locate war in terms of the Clausewitzian idea that it's a duel, that it's a fight between different actors. And I suppose by doing that, the question was, is there something, what else is going on here? Is it that it's just about a fight, or are there other people trying to understand how to quantify the fight, if you like?
Yeah.
We want to measure how likely we are to win the fight. And in that respect, the science of killing is about trying to offer an index for measuring how likely we are to win, if you like, right? I mean, and you can boil it down to the sorts of operational research techniques, the Lanchester equations, and all the other things which are, if we have a 3-to-1 ratio, we will produce these kinds of results. And in that respect, I sort of introduced Depew and the idea of connecting lethality to military effectiveness. But by taking it down a step further from there, and that kind of broader statistical analysis, which I think there's been some great papers, by the way, great articles on Strategy Bridge about some of these things. Of course, the person who wrote this great article has completely escaped me, and I should apologise to them right now because I'm doing them no service.
That's all right. People will have to now go to the Strategy Bridge to find that article. So we've actually done the Strategy Bridge a favour. So you're welcome, Strategy Bridge. Expect a retweet.
Yeah. So, but I apologise to the person. She did some great work, and we had some correspondence and all the rest of it. And because I'm thinking about other stuff, this article in particular, I forgot the name. I wanted to take it down a step from these broader statistical analyses in terms of how to work out how to produce some kind of battlefield result from an organizational perspective. If we apply this ratio of troops to defenders, attackers to defenders, we get this kind of result. If we go down a step and think at a micro detail, can we start understanding how ordnance produces death, which is a particularly unpleasant way of describing this, but that's ultimately, bottom line, what it's about. And it's that point that I got through Small Arms, I suppose, that I started to engage with that idea. How does ordnance produce death? And in this article, I sort of show you that it's a little bit more complicated than everyone otherwise might think. It's not a straightforward. I mean, if it was straightforward, then we would have optimized ammunition, munitions, all the rest of it to the point where we knew precisely how much lethality to put into a particular battle space to produce these kinds of effects. But I'm 100% certain that you can't do that, and I'm also 100% certain that doctors don't know. They can approximate the crossover point between life and death, but they can't. We still haven't cracked how to what all of the things are that produce death when you're in the hospital. So if you could do that,
your heart stops.
Exactly. Your heart stops, but you've got your brain, you've got your heart.
Your heart stops. No, I'm pretty sure that's when they declare you dead, when your heart stops, right? So,
right.
So I've solved it for you, Matt. So,
except of course that there are lots of things going on here that keep people alive artificially, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
That complicate how we think about that. And that's why I start talking about the epistemology, right? When do we know? How do we know? Is there something, what's our theory of knowledge around knowing that crossover point? And so science can take us so far, but, there's still a fuzzy point. I think that's what I want to get at. There's a fuzzy point where we can't quite do the rest.
Yeah, and I guess, the idea of lethality, effective killing, and, effective killing, is it killing people effectively, or is it killing so that you win the war? You might be able to do one and not necessarily achieve the other.
I think that's a really strong point. For sure.
And as we move into all this fourth age, fourth industrial, I don't think it's the fourth age, because I think that's a Tolkien reference. I think it's the fourth industrial revolution, maybe.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, everyone thinks that it's just going to be robots fighting robots, no one's going to die, right? But that's actually just property vandalism.
Yes.
so killing is probably still going to be important in war. Now, you also give a short history of lethality, not just dealing with those. I'm not going to go through and say those three big phrases before, because things like knowledge regimes, knowledge trajectories, they give me a headache. Not because they're not important to academics, but mainly because they're only important to academics. But you give a short history of lethality. So I guess it's apparent that lethality, and I just tried to check for that article on the Strategy Bridge, and there's so many articles on lethality that listeners just go on the Strategy Bridge, read them all, and you'll probably realise whichever one Matt was talking about, or just read Matt's article. But you talk about a history of lethality, so it's not new. There's a lot of stuff on it right now. We know the US is really focused on it. In fact, there's going to be a conference later on this year at the Modern War Institute that's going to focus a bit on lethality. I'm hoping to get there. It's not new though. Like, people have focused on this before, right?
Yes, I mean, for sure. I mean, it's an old idea. It was Olivia, by the way, Olivia Garrard.
Of course, former guest on this show, of course, yeah.
So I'm apologies, Olivia, for your name dropping out of my mind earlier, but
I apologise to Olivia. Matt's a jerk. Anyway, please continue, Matt.
That may well be true. So the point about the reason why I do a short history of lethality is to show you that people have understood this idea differently at different times over time, right? And that, like most scientific endeavours, people argue about it. And those that if we take the doctrinal bit away for a moment and just think about the actual process by which death is produced from ordnance, you find that the science itself is contested, right? There's no settled. I mean, there's an accepted way of thinking about some of these things, But that's not to say that another scientific theory might not come along to explain the phenomena at some point in the future. And that's typically and regularly happened. What's happened is that you've gone through a process that's not particularly scientific to a process that's become more scientific. That's not to say that the idea of how to produce death from weapons hasn't existed a long time. It most certainly has. As we, that was, and it's not to say that engineers, surgeons, and others haven't had something to say about these things through time. In fact, I'm expecting that now I've put this article out there, historians will come back at me and say, well, the idea of lethality goes back to, blah, blah, blah in pre-Roman times or whatever, right? So, but that's kind of to be expected. All I can do is sort of give you a sense of, I suppose, all I've tried to do anyway, is give you a sense of how this idea of lethality has emerged at least in the modern era. And in that respect, you've moved from rules of thumb that help engineers design kit and mass produce kit to things that have become a little bit more precise about how we should think about lethality. And then once we've done that thinking, how do you then amend kit to try and take advantage of that thinking? Which is and there's an iterative exercise using the science to inform the engineering, which is sort of what's been going on, at least in the 20th century, in a much more early 20th century, in a very systematic way, and that's led to all sorts of innovations in equipment, principally 5.56 round in ammunition. Has sort of capitalised on some of the research that came out of the Second World War, but that's kind of important, because if you can optimise the process by which you can produce death, then you need less resources. If you're Britain, for example, you have to import everything during the war, and that means it's much more sensible to figure out the optimal way of producing death from ordnance, because if you can do that, then you can make more out of the limited resources that you can import, and that has a beneficial effect on all sorts of other areas around logistics, the supply chain, training potentially, all sorts of other areas. But the thing that really hit me was that where I really understood that there was a scientific argument was when I found the papers of Professor Solly Zuckerman in East Anglia University. I'd read this great book by Eric Prakash called The Technology of Killing, which I thought had basically sunk my research program. And he quoted the kinetic energy criterion as a criterion by which kinetic energy is typically thought of as dumping 58 foot-pounds of kinetic energy into the body, or 80 joules into the body, produces death. Right? And this was picked up by people like Joanna Bork, who'd written some great stuff on pain, and also she's written a great book on an intimate history of killing. But there's a sort of a sense in which Bork and Prakash don't recognise that there's actually opportunity for a scientific argument to be had about this kinetic energy criterion. And that became really clear to me when I found the papers of Solly Zuckerman, who said, hold on a minute, once we go and look at the evidence, we don't see lethality in terms of kinetic energy. We see it we should define it in terms of momentum effect. The amount of momentum is dumped into the body, produced in the body. There's a probabilistic relationship between momentum effect and hospitalization. And he could demonstrate that by going and examining cadavers from around a number of battlefields, principally starting in France, and then going over to, and then looking at the Blitz during the Second World War. The Blitzkrieg in France, he picked up a lot of evidence there, and then went over to London Blitzkrieg, and he proposed a very important set of a different way of thinking about lethality based on the evidence that he picked up from the battlefield itself. And that actually, the result of that was to annoy a load of, well, I say annoy, it prompted a whole series of other debates between the Americans and the Brits about, which perspective on lethality is more accurate description of the bullet effects or ordnance effects on bodies.
And that, speaking my language when you talk about how to annoy, I like that.
Sorry. Well, it's a scientific debate. So, and that scientific debate it wasn't represented anywhere in the literature, as far as I could see. Certainly not amongst some people who'd written about some really, like I said, Joanna Bork and Eric Prakash, some great authors. But I was just, hold on, there's a nuance here in terms of the history of ballistics that hasn't been taken into account. And I was just trying to put that. This article is built around, if you like, that realization that actually scientists themselves are arguing about what it is, what lethality means.
And probably in a completely different way to the way policymakers and military professionals are as well.
Yeah, right. So that's the second bit of the article. Yeah,
and what I also one point you made that I'll take the they like to say the chair's privilege, but it's my show, so I can just cut you off anytime I want. There's an important point, particularly for our British listeners, is that come October, even importing stuff into the UK is going to be really hard. Never avoid a chance to dig into a Brit about Brexit. For those listeners that live in London, I'll be in London in about a month, and I just have a sheet I'm keeping in my pocket, and I'm just going to walk down the street and make Brexit jokes. I'm pretty sure I'll be probably the most popular Aussie in London. And from what I hear, there's not too many Aussies in London anyway.
Bring Red Cross supplies with you.
Now, we were just about to get into it before I went off on my snark attack. One of the things that I find quite interesting / annoying / really interesting / very annoying is how a lot of this scientific investigation and some of these, I'm glad the scientists annoy each other with these terms, but at least they're using some of these terms in a proper way, right? So they talk about kinetic energy being used to propel projectiles. But these terms have been hijacked, stolen, and some of the concepts have been, mangled or realigned to fit in and go into military doctrine to drive strategies in winning wars, say counterinsurgencies, for instance, and used to develop mechanisms for victory or defeat mechanisms, which is a better way of doing it. Conditions for victory is probably something else. And you kind of address this in the second part of your article. I like how you've called it overkill, counterinsurgency, and military doctrine. Those three words all put together could refer to so much of the past 20 years and so much of the past 60 years, but we're probably just going to focus a little bit. Well, Hugh Davies would probably say it also goes right back until a certain Peninsula campaign, but get over it. What exactly do you mean by this? And please let it be the argument I'm hoping it's going to be.
I'm going to try. I'll try. I mean, basically, if you dump too much kinetic energy into the body, you are inefficiently killing, right? Effectively. Yeah. That is technically overkill, right? The problem with overkill in a counterinsurgency environment is 7.62 rounds goes through several people, not just one.
Yeah.
The result is the lack of...
if you're lucky.
If you're lucky, yeah, right. So, and I've, in my book, Weapon of Choice, I show you that soldiers are unlikely to be able to shoot properly. Right? Yeah. So that's just another plug for why you should go and buy Weapon of Choice. Yeah. So if soldiers can't shoot accurately, and you get ricochets on a large caliber round like 7.62, the potential for shooting accidentally, targeting people that you would otherwise would not want to target increases. And that's problematic because, firstly, you're undermining your ambition. In a counterinsurgency environment, you're undermining the claims that you might be looking to win hearts and minds because you're imprecisely applying kinetic effects. And yet the language of kinetics itself has sort of, as you rightly say, Mick, sort of framing the way we think about how to produce any kind of effect into this counterinsurgency environment in terms of kinetic and non-kinetic or lethal, non-lethal effects onto the battlefield. The ambition is to deliver some kind of military effect or some kind of effect, and the choice for a commander or someone in a difficult environment like counterinsurgency is to decide whether it needs to be a show of force or actually a use of force that has some kind of lethal effect.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, what I think the second half to this is that I show that actually in a civilian context, at least in the UK, partly because the British government has been working very hard to try and restrict access to firearms, the legal understanding of what lethality means is sort of taken from a 58 foot-pounds of kinetic energy to 6 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. So, in a counterinsurgency environment, you're working on the edges of what might be considered to be a military and civilian context. And the question is which of these two lethality criterion apply? Now, the fact that the military criterion applies rather than civilian criterion instantly demonstrates that military life is more valued than civilian life, right?
Yeah.
i.e., we must protect our own people in uniform when they are in difficult environments, rather than the civilians who are subject to our interventions. And I suppose the fact that there is this juxtaposition says something about what is valued by in these situations. And my suggestion is that and for understandable reasons, the military criterion is the acceptable one, right? But the result of all of that, of course, is that the scientific criteria by which you produce death, the scientific criteria, as in 6 foot-pounds, is subordinated to military requirements. So what you instantly see is that the military, there's an ordering of what's important. Military requirements are more important than scientific ones. And yet scientific ones are the ones that are trying to reshape military, the use of armed force, in order to produce more optimal more optimal results, less overkill. And so I just, in the second half of the article, I try and sort of elaborate on how those ideas work. Because, of course, they have immediate effect in terms of, it's not just a doctrine question in terms of how do you manage the media environment and make sure that your right messages come across. But if you produce overly lethal effect, then you undermine your media message as well. Because, and so then the question is, how do you design technologies that sort of map to your doctrinal requirement to manage the information ecology, so that you don't put out mixed messages where you say we're here as your friends, and then on the internet images of overkill are spread about the place.
Yeah, it's what interests me is how it's driven so much thought in a way that I'm not going to say is useless thought, but probably, let's just say, there's been a lot of misspent youths of people getting wrapped around the axles on some of this stuff. I mean, you talk about effects-based operations in your article, where effects-based approach to operations, which some people after General Mattis rejected it, and everyone else sort of said, "Yep, let's get rid of it." Then there became effects-based approaches to targeting, which generally drove a lot of coin operations anyway. But the idea that was something new, but that's actually what militaries were trying to do all the time.
Yeah.
But just labeling a difference between your kinetic and your non-kinetic effects, which for those people that don't know what a non-kinetic effect is, people who use the term probably don't know, but generally it's influence activities, it's ways of shaping the enemy's mind. But then you have lethal and non-lethal effects. But yeah, it's interesting just how far these terms have been twisted into becoming these very, very specific ideas.
Well, so I think the interesting thing there is to trace, and this is the bit I don't necessarily trace, but I think what you see is a sort of split between what it makes sense scientifically, and what makes sense doctrinally.
Yeah.
And in that respect, the word lethality is doing more work than the science is actually allowing for, right? And that's what I suppose that goes back to the point that military concerns are more important than scientific ones generally.
To the military, to
the military, but in terms of this is a core competence, right? How do you produce death on the battlefield? In many respects, armed forces. And I suppose this is the final point of the argument. Armed forces, they want to know how to optimize that, but they don't necessarily want it to be too closely cross-examined, right? Because if you closely cross-examine it, like I did by saying that there's a civilian understanding of what lethality is and a military understanding of what lethality is, then you potentially undermine what's legitimate in terms of how the armed forces apply armed force. And if you go down that route too closely, then it opens up all sorts of questions that potentially are unhelpful for military, certainly in a counterinsurgency context. But my suggestion is that also, you can start, if I keep pushing the argument, can you delegitimize armed force in a conventional context as well? How, if you keep going down this route and say, well, actually, it's 58 foot-pounds is just overkill.
Yeah.
Right? It's not how to but the fact that we've not found a number between 58 and 6 foot-pounds implies that 58 foot-pounds is overkill, and certainly that would be the finding of Solly Zuckerman. He'd find kinetic fragments of munition that went into the body that produced death that had nowhere near the kinetic energy of 58 foot-pounds. And but that opens up all sorts of questions and that's why I suppose there's a sense in which some of these things are a bit of a taboo for the armed forces, right? This is a question that we don't want to spend too much time talking about. We'd much rather get you to think about how to optimize technologies for the purposes of delivering accelerated warfare, or rather than thinking about the nuts and bolts of some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, and be careful here, listeners. You're going to listen to me actually compliment a guest, but I think this is really well summed up in your section just before the conclusion. So the fourth part of your article on legitimation, and also the taboo of lethality within the military. Like discuss it, but don't discuss it too much, too technical, because once you do that and define it, you might actually create boundaries for us that we're not comfortable with. And to me, I think it's also these discussions are only problematic in societies that are open enough to have them. There are plenty of societies where militaries don't need to worry about a discussion on lethality being an issue.
Yes, sure. I mean, go on.
Yeah, so and I guess that's the point, is that it's very interesting scientifically, but when you start using these discussions to justify strategies, you've then got to be prepared for these types of words and these investigations and the science to bleed over into criticisms of national security policy, into criticism of how you prosecute a war, whether it's conventional or whether it's actually just I say just a coin. Having lived the experience, I can say just a coin war, because it's different from a conventional fight. When do we get to the point where we say, well, you actually launched 5 hypersonic missiles to take down those 2 ships? We're not comfortable with that. The lethality ratio only required you to fire 3. When does that become a point? And I guess understanding the science versus people talk about the science and the art of war. Well, this is the science and the art of policy, right?
So I think that's right. That just exposing some of these things for discussion gives democratic societies the and I'm not trying to overblow my contribution to this. This is just an observation about the
A
need.
leader in the field, ladies and gentlemen. A leader in the field.
I'd say fuck off here, but you know.
Careful, there's kids listening.
Yeah, right. I got now, but but you know, there is a point at which democratic societies need to sort of understand what they are doing when they accept these particular criteria. You know, by exposing it as a point of discussion, you say, well, we'd rather fight this way rather than that way. Whereas, you know, at the moment, some of those kinds of there are things that are sort of taken as accepted because of the expertise of people in uniform. And I can understand why society might delegate that. But, you know, in an internet age where citizen journalists and are regularly using overkill or online when it's portrayed online to reframe strategic narratives, you know, then of course we absolutely do need to think about what we are doing when we are using systems that produce by necessity overkill. Right now, you know, when it comes to, I don't think society would be responsible for society to put people in uniform into difficult spots where they didn't have the means to defend themselves. But because that would be just totally unreasonable. But at the same time, you know, it should make us think about how we employ armed force in the first place, which does open up the need to think more carefully about how these terms are used. Which I think in that respect, I'm violently agreeing with you. You know, so much of the doctrine has sort of infused the way people reflect on and think about military power. That, you know, some of the basics we need. You know, there's still an opportunity to have a discussion about some of those basics. It seems to me. And even if that discussion that discussion needs to be an ongoing one, right? It's not that it's ever going to get settled. It's just that it's going to be a permanent negotiation and affirmation about what it is that society will or won't accept. And I think that's a totally reasonable and democratic way of proceeding when it comes to thinking about armed force.
I would also just like to point out that all of our non-kinetic effects listeners got extremely juiced when you said the word strategic narrative. Look, listeners, we could talk about this all night. In fact, me and Matt have been, but we're going to move on to something now that I like to call the moneymaker. It's not the final question; it's the bonus question, and it's for subscribers. And I call it the moneymaker because they literally pay for the rent on the hosting server that keeps this show going. Why do I need them to do that? Because I'm cheap. Now, we'll just have a quick pause. And that was another brilliant pause there. Now, we're up against the clock, Matt. You can't give a long-winded answer to this question because, you're a British academic, so I actually have to say that by law. But we're up against the clock for the software we're using. So, and my computer is trying to restart itself at the same time. Your computer will restart in 15 seconds. Let's not do that. I'm literally let's do that later. Okay, so my final question is one I ask of all guests. You know this because you've answered it before. You've answered it twice.
What did I say last time?
I don't know. I don't listen to the episodes with you in it. And it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible. And just like Big Carl, we're going to continue this conversation about what war is and what it means. Now, I just want to point out before you answer this, no pressure, but your episode on small arms is only our third most popular episode. Our most popular episode is episode number 1, which is utterly ridiculous because it's a terrible episode and it's just me speaking, but hey. Our second best episode is the one on Karl von Clausewitz with Don Stoker, which is understandable given the show's called The Dead Prussian, and then it's you. So really, like you're as good as number 1, right? So no
like
pressure.
Guns, right? People
no
like guns,
pressure.
they like me swearing, and my little aphorisms on war are going down the storm.
That's good. Now I get to ask the question before you answer it. So you need to define the sentence "war is."
War is a continuation of the dead Prussian by other means.
That's our most bullshit answer yet, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks. We can all just thanks Matt for coming along and providing it. Because you've given 2 definitions before, I'll let you get away with that this time. Also because you've just spent spent some significant time putting some scientific basis behind one of my personal gripes, which is good because now I can say, hey, it's not me. An actual smart person has said this as well. Or, someone people have certified as a smart person.
Well, that wouldn't be me. That would be Solly Zuckerman. Put it down to him.
That's who I meant. Now, look, Matt, thanks for coming on the show. I'm sure you'll be on here again because it's kind of what we do. Thanks for coming on the show and talking about all these very interesting terms.
Thanks, mate. Pleasure. Till next time.
Now, listeners, there will be next time because Matt's episodes tend to be quite popular. And you can help make them more popular, not just by sharing these episodes with your friends, your family, your grandparents, your personal ballistic scientist. You can also follow Matt on Twitter at War Matters, and it's all one word, War Matters. And you get into a debate with him. He loves it. I've been tweeting while we've been on the show. I don't know if Matt's noticed because he's probably been a little bit busy answering the questions that I sent him and he didn't read. And also, look, Weapon of Choice is a fantastic book. And I know that last time we aired an episode, one or two people bought it. So I'm responsible for Matt being able to pay off his mortgage.
Thanks, mate.
But get along and look at it. It's a very interesting look at small arms. Hey, as he says, people like guns. Listen to that previous episode. I'll get the number for you listeners right now so that I can plug my own show, which was episode 32. Listen to it. We make a few cracks. We have a few cracks at the NRA, I think, in there. And any NRA members that listen to this show, I know there's a few of them. Hey, feel free to just have some sensible gun laws. And for those listeners that haven't just tuned out because I've criticised their national creed, you can find us on Patreon. You can subscribe and you can get some of the bonus content and learn a little bit more. You also get opportunity to find out who our upcoming guests are and provide suggested questions. No one did that for this one because no one knew who Matt was. Actually, I didn't tell anyone Matt was coming on the show. I was scared of the questions they were going to get me to ask. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.